All right, so jumping back into it, we're talking about the national savings and investment identity. And if we rework things, we'll find that in a trade deficit, we have to, in order for, if you're in a situation where there's a trade deficit, meaning that you're in a situation where this thing right here is positive, then essentially what that is telling us is that's telling us that this whole thing over here has to also be positive, right? So the other way that we can write that is we can say I minus S minus T minus G has to be greater than 0. And so if we rearrange this, if we add plus the government savings to each side, we end up with I minus S greater than T minus G. And if we end up adding S to each side, then we end up with this identity that states that in a deficit, the only way we can survive in a deficit, the money has to come from somewhere. And so because of the fact that investment and trade are so related, when we're in a trade deficit, your investment, both from abroad and internally, has to be greater than any kind of private savings or any kind of government or public savings. So that's why these things are so interrelated. In a trade deficit, you are inextricably tied to having an influx of capital. You need influxes of capital in order to cover the trade deficit because of the savings and investment identity. Now, the flip side of this is also true, where if we were in a trade surplus, we would rewrite that trade surplus to be just the opposite of this. We would have it be X minus M. And again, that would be something that we would assume to be positive. And so after rearranging our equations, we would end up with X minus M is equal to all of our private savings plus all of our government savings, tax receipts minus government spending, minus all of the investment. So this is saying that domestic savings are going to be higher than domestic investment, and therefore extra financial capital is going to be invested abroad. So again, let's spell that out. This is supposed to be positive. Since this is supposed to be positive, we can rewrite this as S plus T minus G minus I is greater than 0. We can move I to the other side. We end up with S plus T minus G is greater than I. And this is really where we leave off. This is our domestic savings, both public and private. And this is our domestic investment. So since our domestic savings is greater than our domestic investment, they're going to be looking for yield, just like the podcast talked about in terms of the Japanese yield curve control. And so as a result of all of this stuff, the consequence is that the extra financial capital will be invested abroad to get some sort of yield. So another way that we can look at the national savings and investment identity is to look at what would individual changes do to the trade deficit, or what would be the necessary corresponding change in the trade deficit. So that whole notion is essentially, what will cause trade deficits to rise or fall through our savings, investment, and public savings behavior. So we would rewrite this equation to have, so we would essentially be using this equation from up here. And we'll talk specifically about trade deficits, but we're just going to flip it. Instead of the m over x being over here, we're going to have the m minus x be over here. And we've got investment minus savings minus taxes plus government spending. This should be T minus G. And so we can break this up and we can take a look at, what would happen, right? So if we had if there was zero change to savings, if there was zero change to public savings, and if there was an increase in our investment, then what would have to happen? Our trade deficit would have to rise. So this is telling us that if domestic investment increases, ceteris paribus, and nothing else happens, right? Then the trade deficit must rise. And so all of this to really just talk about the fact that the trade deficit or a trade surplus in and of itself is not a bad thing. We have to look at the context of what is going on and the surrounding situation about what's going on globally as well. So both the internal context and the external context. What if we had an increase in our private savings, but everything else stayed the same? So if we had no change in domestic investment, a positive change in private savings, and no change in public domestic savings, then what's going to happen to our trade deficit? It's going to have to fall, right? So because of the fact that savings enters into this thing negatively, if the domestic savings decreases, then our trade deficit has to decrease. So this is saying if domestic savings increase, then the trade deficit must fall. And then lastly, we can mix it up this time. If the investment stays the same, if the private saving stays the same, but if the public saving decreases, like here in the United States, if we're constantly going further and further into debt, then what is the consequence? If we're going further into debt, the trade deficit is going to increase. Very good. So this is if public savings decreases, then the trade deficit must increase, which is what we are seeing, have seen for quite a while. But again, at the end of the day, a deficit or a surplus in and of itself is not a good or a bad thing, or a bad or a good thing, respectively. The book does a good job of detailing some examples. Again, this is one of those times where I really would point to you to read the section, what is it, 10.4. Reading 10.4 and 10.5 are going to do you a lot of good. We'll still cover most of the stuff, but I'm not going to cover it in the exhausting way that the book does. And it's got some very good historical examples backing stuff up in a semi-interesting way, at least for economic stuff.